It's 15:00 and we should be starting on our somewhat free format conversation with Smari McCarthy on whether it's too late to be pessimistic about climate change. Smari McCarthy has a bit of a colored past, but his last gig was being a member of the Icelandic Parliament for the Icelandic Pirate Party. But I'm sure Smari can extend this introduction further.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I was actually told that I was supposed to give you an optimistic talk about climate change. And there was this question of, okay, first off, how does one do that? But secondly, is that the talk I would necessarily give? And after thinking about it a little bit, I'm like, I think I can actually be fairly optimistic about climate change. But before we can get optimistic, we need to really dive down into the pessimism and really understand how bleak this can get. But then we'll work our way up from there. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to give you like a little bit of an intro, and then hopefully we can turn this into a bit of a conversation. So, so just like, how do I end up doing this? Well, while I was in the Icelandic Parliament, I was in part taking care of climate policy for my party, and we were, always trying to figure out how we could improve things. And I started asking these really annoying questions, like, okay, hi, we're spending all this money, like all these governments all around the world are spending all this money on trying to fix climate change. Why are we not fixing climate change yet? What's the problem? Why is this hard? And the deeper I got down into this question, and I talked to people in the ministries, I talked to people in business, academia, I went all the way to like the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and just asking everybody I could find, like, how come we're not fixing this? And one of the things that became clear is we don't really know how yet. So let's start here. I'm going to start with a quote from a book called Uninhabitable Earth. It's by David Wallace Wells. Some of you might have read it. It's actually, I'm going to take two quotes and splice them together. But he says, at 2 degrees, the ice sheets will begin their collapse. 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity. Major cities in the equatorial band of the planet will become unlivable. And even in northern latitudes, heat waves will kill thousands each summer. Then he goes on to say, the upper end of the probability curve put forward by the United Nations to estimate the end of the century high emission scenario put us at 8 degrees warming. Warming of that level would require a suicidal cocktail of sadistic policy, public indifference, and catastrophic luck. At 8 degrees, humans at the equator and in the tropics would not be able to move around without dying. Hardly any land on the planet would be capable of efficiently producing any of the food we now eat. Forests would be roiled by rolling storms of fire, and coasts would be punished by more and more intense hurricanes. Okay, so that's the 8-degree warming scenario, and the 2-degree warming scenario. So I think we can relatively safely say that the 1.5-degree warming scenario, that ship has sailed, right? So on the 1.5-degree warming, this is a virtual inevitability. We might possibly be able to back out from that one, but it seems very unlikely. We're already most of the way there, and this is just our reality now, right? The average temperature on Earth was 15 degrees Celsius when we started this mess. Now it's going to be about 16.5. That's if we manage to stop everything now. The 8-degree scenario is where life is really absolutely fucked, okay? And not just absolutely, but comprehensively fucked. But here's the good news. He said, a suicidal cocktail of sadistic policy, public indifference, and catastrophic luck would be required in order for this situation to manifest, right? So, okay, we probably can't control luck much, but let's come back to that one. But policy and indifference are entirely controllable, right? And some people are currently indifferent, and there seems to be a bit of a, shall we say, political alignment on that topic. So more right-wing people are more likely to be indifferent, more left-wing people are more likely to be outraged, but in general, neither is actually helping much to fix the problem at the moment. So let's try and address this in a useful way. And actually, a useful way to think about this is to not confuse indifference with a lack of agency. Because there are certainly people who are indifferent, but I think there's a lot more people who are really scared or at least somewhat concerned who would like to fix this problem, but don't know how. Much like all of these people I was talking to about this stuff in various governments and whatnot. So if we are talking about the literal millions of people in the world who would like to do something, it might be hundreds of millions or whatever, what they have in common is they don't necessarily know what exactly to do. They are uncertain what helps. They are somehow being inefficient with the money and resources and capabilities that they do have. And, those are actually sufficient. So this is one of those things where we shouldn't attribute to malice where ignorance will suffice. But this isn't willful ignorance. This is just we don't really know how this stuff works yet. And broadly, this is harkening back to what I was saying at my talk yesterday, whenever it was. I've lost count. So the issue is not as simple as just reducing the emissions of CO2 and capturing more CO2. It's also this much more complex thing of dealing with processes such as desertification and eutrophication of lakes and rivers. Those are much more complex chemical processes, and we can't just reduce it to a single number. And I have this just strong complaint about using CO2 as the metric. It is CO2 amount in the atmosphere is a really good metric for the scale of the problem, but it is not a good metric for the scale of the solution. If we are only measuring the solutions by how well they remove CO2 from the atmosphere, then we're going to be missing things such as ecosystem failure, mass extinction events, things like that, and not to mention desertification, that are actually very problematic.
Quick question to interject. Isn't the scale of the solution not equally important as the complexity of the solution?
Yes. Okay, so if you want to talk about scale, yeah, sure. But okay, so desertification globally, it's about 120,000 square kilometers per year. That's about just slightly more land than Iceland. It's also about 3 Belgiums. We're running out of Belgiums. What? One Switzerland. Yeah, that's a good metric. And it's also going to annoy the Swiss, so I like it. So that desertification isn't coming from one source. It isn't just the heating. The vast majority of it is due to overgrazing or an agricultural over-extraction of nitrogen and nutrients. So there's a thing where you can actually catalog the causes, and about half of them are social, and the other half are somehow need an engineering solution. And as far as I can tell, nobody's really working on the engineering side of things on a large scale. Everybody who's working in this field is working on trying to teach farmers and other experts to be better at doing their thing. So the 2 big anti-desertification projects that are kind of ongoing. One is in China. The other's the Great Green Wall project in Africa. That one's hardly started. The Chinese one is actually going pretty well, so that's great. But the biggest success story that I can point at is that in the 1950s, Iceland was a complete wasteland, and now it's only partially a wasteland. So, you know, we've made progress. But if I just quickly go back to the policy side of things, and yeah, so I maintain that people generally want to help. People want to fix this. The fact that we're all here is evidence of that, and the fact that there's events like Extinction Rebellion and whatnot, you know, organizations, you know, of all sorts, is evidence of that. And if you talk to politicians, even they are kind of like, yeah, no, we need to do something. Their failing is more that they don't know exactly what to do. So bad policy, which would be one element of our cocktail, bad policy comes from lack of understanding, it comes from insufficient or incorrect information, it comes from conflicting priorities, and often traditionalist arguments, and then sometimes political bad faith. Now, having worked in politics for a few years, I can tell you political bad faith is nowhere near as common as we would like to believe. It's so easy to say, oh, that guy's an asshole, and everything he says is just like, he's just shilling for the something or other. And sure, there are people who are like that, but most of them are not. And it's super helpful for any conversation to assume some good faith, and especially, again, here, ignorance and insufficient and incorrect information is sufficient to explain it.
Another question here. How does identity politics figure in this equation for you?
Now you're just trying to take us off track. Identity politics is largely getting in the way of solutions. So one of the things that has been happening, I'm not saying that identity politics is always bad, but there is an element of it which causes people to kind of heighten the otherness of their adversaries, and especially when we're talking about like the political right. For instance, there was a colleague of mine in the Icelandic Parliament from a far right-wing party, you know, and generally I didn't really like agree with him on a lot of things. But when he left politics, he went to work for the UN Convention on Desertification, combating desertification, because, you know, he actually felt that that was an important thing. So, you know, there's some good there, even in the far right people. But you have a...
Yeah, I would like to question on the on policy. I mean, there's many emerging economies which will manifest themselves in the upcoming years. Their needs are probably more focused on, you know, leveling the playing field, getting up there, being competitive in the world market. Do you consider that not a hazard to? Also combating climate change.
Yes. Absolutely. So this is where I mentioned conflicting priorities. So when you hear of China saying, "Oh, we're going to have to spin up this many coal plants just to keep up with our energy production needs," you know, yes, that's terrible and it's terrifying and it's really counterproductive. But at the same time, you know, and I'm no fan of Chinese policy, neither nationally or internationally or whatever, but they are actually a country that has defined very clear goals and very ambitious goals with regards to carbon reduction. So, like, there's one of those things where, yes, what they're doing, you know, more power plants is actually bad, but at least they're explaining why they're doing it and what their plan is to stop doing it. And so there's something where one of the things that we can do is hopefully help develop better technologies, more technologies that can make the transition faster and easier. So China at the moment, just one moment, China at the moment has the largest amount of solar panels in the world. Like, so they're doing the best on that front. While, but we're giving them a hard time because they have a growing middle class who want to have electricity in their homes. Like, I think we should try to find ways of being helpful there rather than necessarily always being in the attack mode. The other thing I'll say on that before I hand the mic to Walter is, in international trade, my favorite quote of all time comes from the Indian negotiator at the original GATT agreement, where they were talking about whether there should be preferential treatment for developing countries. And this guy said, let me get this right because it's so nicely worded. Equality is equitable only among equals. Right? Equality is equitable only among equals. So treating all countries the same way and holding everybody to the same standard is going to be very evil and counterproductive. And when we're looking at countries like China and India in particular that have a long way to go in terms of energy production capacity and just bringing their middle class up to a better wealth and life standard, let's also bear in mind that like the closest thing we've had recently to a serious mass death event due to wet bulb temperature hitting 31 degrees Celsius, where the air basically becomes unsurvivable. It's a sauna where people just die. That was in Tamil Nadu about a month ago in India. They hit 29.7 degrees. So like Indians understand the need to fix this. So let's try to be nice and give them a break, but try and help everybody along the way, because it turns out we all share one atmosphere, and we definitely need to make progress. But let's try to be equitable, not just equal. Yeah.
And to follow up, isn't there an opportunity to just leapfrog fossil fuels especially for Africa, by going straight to solar PV?
Yes, and this is kind of where I wanted to turn this into a conversation. So, what I started with was this quote from David Wallace Wells and his definition of let me find that wording again. The suicidal cocktail of sadistic policy, public indifference, and catastrophic luck. Okay, now just to say regarding luck is actually just what we call a failure to understand statistics, right? If we understand statistics, there is no luck anymore. There's just playing the game correctly, right? So I'd say let's turn this into a bit of a conversation about things like leapfrogging, the petrochemicals, about all of these different technologies and all these different methods that would help. But focus on how do we reduce public indifference, how do we avoid sadistic policy, and how do we improve our understanding so that we don't have to rely on not having catastrophically bad luck, right? Does that sound like a good plan? And if we do this correctly, the way that the outcome of this comes is I'd like it if we could take some notes. I don't know exactly how we can do that yet. I mean, we could use this, I suppose, but what so the ask here is, let's not just be techno-optimists on here, because let's also look at the politics and the reality, the real politics of people having different constraints, different needs, different the competing interests. And let's try to be humane about it, because look, we're all going to suffer if we fuck this one up. So maybe we can, in a nice, friendly way, come up with a set of good policies, good technologies, and so on, that don't assume that everybody's going to be a bike riding, vegan, hug the gay whales type of person. That would be great, but we're not going to get everybody in the world to do that. So yeah, all right.
Question. CO2 reduction is important, but I think the CO2 we emit today affects the climate in 10 or 20 years from now. So what we are suffering right now is from CO2 of the past. So how can you CO2 reduction right now won't necessarily prevent climate change on this moment because it's already emitted. So how would we? Yeah, is it necessary to reduce CO2 to avoid climate change in the future?
Yeah. So. Okay, so the thermal buffers of the planet, like the atmosphere, and the oceans. The ocean is a much bigger buffer, but it's also much slower moving. So they store heat, but the CO2 in the atmosphere now, yes, it's old CO2 that's causing the problem now, but it's because it's been accumulating over time. So making quick movements now can actually fix things relatively quickly. We don't actually understand how quickly, but so I'm not super concerned about that. But yeah, so okay, we got indifference. We got sadistic policy, and we got bad luck, catastrophic luck. Okay, so your task. Let's fill these in with ways of flipping these in our favor, right? For all humanity. Anybody want to start? Catastrophic luck.
Bad luck.
Bad luck.
Very bad luck. So for indifference, I'm thinking that people should bear the consequences of their own behavior in some kind of way. There should be like a feedback loop, like carbon in the air. The time gets hot, they will take a holiday.
So in using economic incentives or regulatory incentives. Oh yeah, okay. So
Incentives rather than taxes or punishments.
yeah,
Incentives rather than taxes or punishments because you want good things. Like, right? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Yeah. Punishment doesn't really work.
But there is maybe tracking externalities. Like you know, if we look at like you know, deforestation on a large scale, a lot of the reason deforestation and like you know, certain other industries work is because the industries themselves are not made to pay for the externalities. The oil industry is the massively subsidized industry in the world, and that's not even counting the externalities, right? So so externality.
Internalizing costs, right? That you're talking
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I was saying, so to counter indifference, one of the things you can do is internalizing the costs that are now external to,
Yeah.
so that you're actually paying for the footprint of the things you're using, right? Yeah.
And then also include the lesser known parts of this cost, like logistics and storing stuff, and get the whole chain of the product that you're using, get it incorporated in this CO2 tax.
Yeah. So there's work there being done on like tracking, you know, smart logistics chains, that kind of thing. So yeah, I put internalized externalities under policy because it sounds less of an issue about public indifference and more about like making sure that the rules are good.
Yeah, can we just actually define indifference? Because I think taxes and punishments, as we want to call them, yes, work on, say, companies, but taxes on individuals to combat indifference is regressive. So incentives on individuals, as in us, are not. So I want to define what we're talking about when we talk about indifference.
Yeah. Yeah. So and I think in some ways this is kind of the PR aspect. Like, you know, it's so let's imagine.
So we're not talking about big polluters here. We're talking about the public.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can we institute one rule? It makes it easier if it just takes the person with the microphone talks.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take like I want to make a caricature here for a moment. Like imagine the person who is least concerned about climate change of all people, right? Now, I think you all have roughly the same idea of it's going to be a white man, probably in his 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, yeah? He's going to be, reasonably, not necessarily wealthy, but sufficiently well off, right? He's going to live in the West. He's going to possibly live in a rural area. And his indifference, where does it stem from? It doesn't affect him. That's, yeah. Okay. But so if it doesn't affect him, so he doesn't care, how do we make that person care? Like, I'm not saying force him to care, but like figure out a way to assist that person in caring. And so I actually occasionally talk to people like this, and what I find is that it's not even that they don't care per se, it's that they just don't believe that it's actually a problem. And like I heard this guy saying, like, even if this is real, what's Greta Thunberg going to do about it? And it's like, come on, this is a adult guy, he's supposed to know better than, but he really simplified it down to this level. And I'm like, no, look, they're climate scientists, they actually know what they're doing. This is real, we've measured it, why don't you care? And so what kind of incentives would work on that kind of person? Do you want to?
Also, I don't think this. I don't see where the basis that the idea that penalizing even regular people. I mean, obviously, if we quintuple the price of meat, this isn't really going to affect people's. Like, it's going to change the cost of that. If we quintuple the cost of gasoline, it will have slightly more impact, but it will ultimately end up beneficial.
That's an argument that comes from privilege. People need to be able to eat and drive themselves around and do all kinds of things. Punishing people for living their lives, especially if they're poor, I think is extremely regressive.
I specifically singled out meat.
Yeah, but
You said meat.
Meat.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So should we talk about food for a moment? Okay, so global food production, so it's about 5.4 billion tons of meat, it's about 6.3 billion tons of vegetables a year, a few hundred million tons of fish, and then what? Like, which part of the food system can we actually optimize? And again, let's take it through this. Do we have sadistic policy that's making our food systems worse? Yeah. Okay. So what do we do here? Stop subsidizing the meat industry. Okay. Okay. We could do that. But could we maybe also think about the way in which monocultures are extracting nitrogen from soil in unsustainable ways? How reliance on industrial fertilizers are causing the microbiomes in the soil to basically not produce, not bind nitrogen, right? So I think just not subsidizing, stopping subsidizing the meat industry alone is insufficient. It's probably part of the answer, but what's a big answer?
Well, I think we have also to the food for the animals is also a big problem, because lots of times the rainforests are cut because they have to build that kind of food monocultures somewhere in Southern America or somewhere, and so I think probably we should forbid to import that kind of stuff if it's a very if it's produced in a way that that's very, very bad for the climate and for the nature.
Yeah. We'll do this. So
Okay. Yeah. So I think Just even without addressing like the meat industry and pointing the finger there, putting stuff local and making sure that food for animals is produced locally. You have a closed loop, especially also in the Netherlands. We have this nitrogen problem, which is exactly this problem. It's nitrogen that is harvested in Brazil is brought over here and is added to the system, and then you have an excess. And then instead of using that fertilizer, you use artificial fertilizer for growing the crops that you'll eat. So if you make any kind of like farming for animals also land-bound, and say that the loops have to be closed, the cycle has to be closed locally, that is already a big systemic improvement, apart from the fact that you need to scale down a lot of these things. So.
Yeah, I think the big issue here is, as you mentioned, monoculture crop growing, but I don't think the solution is involved in making sure that the monoculture the crops grown for animal feed are by definition going to be cheap and the same and ubiquitous. So you're not going to solve that problem by just making it locally instead of in other places and shipping it. So the policy would need to be specified towards ensuring that more varied and diverse crops are grown in fields, which is by definition not a simple policy to make.
Yeah, so just to note, we're using these microphones as indicators of who can talk, partially because we're using them to record for the stream, but when it's not amplified in here, so speak up if you're talking. Just to add to that point, so there are definitely one of the reasons we seem to be doing monocultures on a large scale is because all of the so after the Green Revolution we've had much better access to industrial fertilizers and been able to scale up those processes and hyper optimize them. But now we're realizing that that was a local optimization. It was like an optimization trap, and maybe now people are talking about things like regenerative agriculture, which is fantastic, but we don't know how to scale that up yet. So if anybody's got ideas.
Yeah, so the monoculture, when I think of that, I also think of Monsanto, who grow seeds and pesticides which only work together.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of regulation to protect their intellectual property.
Yep.
There's different ways of growing seeds. I think the Netherlands is an example of that, but I'm not too keen on the details, where you can use each other's seeds to create new seeds again, and there's like it's an open source model on seed creation, and I think we could use more of that too, because I think monocultures are due to companies like Monsanto.
Also, fertilizers take about 2% of the global energy use. I think it's probably best to have the system monetize the guys that do the good things and create a policy on that. So if you could do like a permaculture food garden and you grow things there, you sell it from there, then you get subsidized. And if you do it in a less good way, in a greenhouse, large greenhouse with heated with Russian gas and using industrial fertilizers, then these also vegetables should be more expensive than the well-grown ones. And that's a discussion all separately from the meat, but only the vegetables. But yeah, I think that's a way to incentivize people to buy the good stuff.
But it doesn't answer the question of scaling up.
Right. Yeah, this is actually a really important point that Walter brings up. Yeah. But so specifically, one of the things all of us rely on, whether we are happy to admit it or not, is like we're getting foods on a regular basis. Like I live in Iceland. Like if I were only eating local food there, it would become very monotonous. There would be no avocados. There would be very few berries. There would be like it would not be a fun time. so much of the food that we eat is reliant on global supply chains. So I think the next thing we should go to is transportation, because I do like this talk about the food system, but the other part of the other side of the food system is the distribution channels. And on that, we have shipping, we have cargo freight on trains and such. We have aviation. That always becomes a hot topic. But yeah, anybody else on the agriculture?
You could, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So recently there was a report of a long-term study on agriculture and especially fertilizer use and mixing some of the kind of things we know from permaculture, like nitrogen binding crops, cycling over fields together with using manure, and also mixing with artificial fertilizers. And the effect was actually that this improved harvest from the current mainstream big models. So there are definitely, at least in some transition, hybrid models possible that have a higher or similar yield to what we now would call traditional agriculture. So there definitely is promising research in that respect.
What is very important, I think, is that the farmers get a fair price for the products, because then they also are capable to invest in new technologies and to perform it with the greenhouses, to use the warmth from the summer and store it in earth and get it back in the winter, for example. So. But now that it's not possible. They're really getting much too low price for the products.
Okay, so make food more expensive. I mean I don't disagree with this, and this is a balancing act.
Maybe remove supermarket profits.
Yeah. Okay, we can figure that one out. There's a few there's I think 2 more, and then
Transport will be
Yeah.
a good topic to know.
I just think it raises an interesting point that was raised earlier that I think is central to the whole discussion, which is the fact that there needs to be a massive price adjustment, a massive negative externality price adjustment happen for this whole thing to work. However, if we were to, as you say, make the farmers earn the correct amount for the crops, if we were to stop subsidizing the oil industry and stop subsidizing other industries, then people would have to start paying a lot more for things that they're used to not paying as much for, which would increase inequality quite significantly, I believe. So in the Department of Statistic Policies, I think there needs to be some way of making the negative externalities that are currently not being paid for to be not paid for equally by everyone. That is, the poorest percentage of people do not need to pay the same amount for gas or other things, such as those that have higher income, or everybody pays the same amount, but the money used from these raised taxes is used to subsidize the existence of those that cannot afford to live otherwise, because we cannot simply eradicate the poorest part of the world and then expect to go on. I mean, that's not the way to be.
Isn't me.
Leider dan is lang. Well, niet zo fijn te doen als dit.
I actually just wanted to mention a couple of good projects that I've heard of that are doing really cool development on helping farmers track the price throughout the entire supply chain, and specifically on luxury crops like vetiver. So food is one thing, right? We all need to eat food, but a luxury crop like vetiver that makes perfume, like that's a really amazing one to track through and incentivize the farmers to keep the vetiver in the ground for longer, because it's become a cash crop, so they pull it out of the ground. Incentivizing them to keep it in the ground for longer increases the quality of the vetiver, which also increases the price of a luxury product overall. But there's also certain incentives and benefits to the soil as well. So this is a Haitian project that's doing really well. So there are projects out there that are doing really cool stuff about helping farmers track the price. Just thought I'd kind of a little bit of good news out there.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. The goal of the session was to be hopeful and positive, and I think we are generally going in that direction. But so projects like that are exactly the right kind of thing. I definitely want to hear about a lot of them. But I think this framing is about like not just how do we hope blindly, but how do we generate hopeful scenarios, right? So did you? One of you had a.
Sorry. Well, actually, it ties in a bit with what was said before. Pay the farmers better is kind of a good idea, but the reason why farmers are not feeling paid well is because of the entire financial structure around the industry, right? Which is essentially driven by pure profit motives, profit for the profit. And I think as long as that is a driving factor of our food system, or many other things as well probably, that's never going to really get solved, I think.
Then I'm going to jump in and kind of jump out of my role as facilitator. As soon as you talk about profit for the people, not profit for profit, you end up having identity politics. And roughly half of society will just tune out and say, fuck off, hippie. And yes, and that is not helpful on the indifferent side of the equation.
I'm not against profits as a principle, but profit for the profit as a... I mean, without any other... Basically, food production the goal of food production should be food production, not making a profit. Making a profit is a means to assure that food production.
So, I'm loving how excited people are about things. One point on this, and then I'd like to move on to like transportation side of things a little bit. But I put in land reform here, and have any of you read a book called How Asia Works? Okay, it's very good, and one of the things that they point out there is that if you look at the successful economies in Asia, one of the things that unites them is that they all went through massive land reform after World War II. And what that did was it caused farmers to generally have much less land, and that led to them being way more productive on the land, right? And so maybe land reform, and I mean this in the context of agriculture, but also how we treat urban environments, how we organize land in general, might be one of the things. And of course, as a recovering anarchist, I feel the need to point out that land is one of the great monopolies that we need to be countering. So, but yeah, urban stuff and transportation.
Transportation is exactly easy.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay, so we talked about local production. I'm from the Fab Lab community. I believe also in global design. And so if we are setting up the sessions that we have here, and we maybe have some politicians or a country that is open to experiment, I would suggest global design and local production.
Okay, so yeah, this is the old Fab Lab mantra of design locally, emerge globally. And so I helped work on, well, I got the first Fab Labs in Iceland started, and managed to make it a policy in Iceland that every secondary school should have a Fab Lab associated with it. That was part of what my party was doing. So this is right. I would like to go more into global design, but you have a point.
Yeah, I was going to say hopeful things about transport, but now we're derailing into this conversation.
No, bring it.
I first want to respond to that remark. Fab Labs are fantastic for prototyping stuff. For anything that is at prices we've grown used to, we have to go back and look at Henry Ford. Well, Henry Ford was not even the inventor of mass production, but he was the first to do it for, let's say, high-end consumer good like a car. That is something Fab Labs cannot do. For mass production, you still need two parts of your equation and that is you have your you have certain raw materials that you can only produce at scale. You cannot have a steel mill in your Fab Lab if you want to use steel to produce anything, or a paper mill, or you could have a fab lab in a paper mill, but the paper mill itself is already an industrial scale operation at scale, and you want to do forestry at scale as well.
This is too much in the weeds, but yeah.
Say again?
You're going on for too long.
Okay.
You're talking too much.
I'll veer. You have been waiting for this literally 11 years to tell me. But the other bit I want to veer back to, transport, except aviation, and aviation is roughly 2.5% of carbon emissions. So as much as I hate bloody Schiphol and everything related to that, it is not our biggest problem. Shipping, especially long distance shipping, is nasty with bunker oil. Once you switch to LNG, and there are other options, wind could easily be recast in a relatively easily, but it's more of an engineering problem than a fundamentals, and it has to do with certain incentives in the shipping industry. That's not happened yet, but the current supply chains that reach into East Asia and back can be made carbon neutral without changing drastically. The last mile shipping can be electrified. The only really hard nut to crack would be aviation, but like I said, aviation is in terms of transport more of a footnote than a major issue. So, and that's actually good news, because the more you have to change in your supply chains, in the way you work, the more resistance you will encounter.
I would add to that people like to complain about the aviation industry because everybody sees the planes in the sky, and it's very strongly connected with ideas about luxury and but it is around 2% to either side of the 2% mark, and the aviation industry, because they're always under this kind of criticism and scrutiny, are actually trying to improve themselves. So I will kind of defend them a little bit, not just because I like flying, but
I hate flying, and I will still say it's relatively speaking a footnote.
But that said, I like it when we're hard on people in that way. And Ella's talk yesterday, where she's just trashing, all sorts of things like that. It's even if I don't necessarily fully agree, we need to apply that pressure, right? So on that note, so I went to visit Ulsan in Korea a couple of years ago. And there I visited the largest car factory in the world, which spits out one new car every 3 seconds. And next door to it is the largest the ship factory in the world. And there I was visiting, amongst others, with a guy who's the head of a very large international shipping corporation. And they were laying up, I think it was 14, 15 new ships, cargo ships, each of which was supposed to take 13,000 container units. And I asked the guy, have you considered powering them by nuclear instead of diesel? And he was like, no, why would we do that? So how do we address this kind of indifference? I mean, and we've been very much on the policy side. I think there might be a slight rules-oriented thing here, but how do we make people who are at the top of the shipping industry go hey, maybe we ought to decarbonize our shipping fleet?
Maybe internalize the cost of carbon energy into the energy price. So it eventually all comes down to internalizing cost. And it needs to be put into financial what reaches people, which is their finances.
Yeah. Okay. So we do have there's an international agreement, about so using crude oil on ships in international waters. So that's been progress. That's now not allowed. Whether people are actually enforcing it, that's another question. But that is one step towards internalizing those. But
so just a few random facts, not really anything useful. So there is actually one nuclear-powered shipping vessel operating. Russia has one, but it doesn't. It's not allowed to go into port, so it has to have this design where it can carry these they call them lighters, they're smaller ships that can then it can lower, and they're basically barges, and somebody tows them into port. But there's a bunch of legal complexities around that. So that is solving that problem of having the shipping ship that doesn't actually go into the port, and having that be a reasonable thing for people to do is the main thing to get the nuclear working. The other problem is that the shipping companies, actually these giant container ships, they don't build them to last that long. And the reactors, like at least the military reactor, like the reactors that the U.S. military uses, might last longer than these ships. I'm not sure. So obviously that should be fixed too. But that's just these are just too fast. Okay, thanks.
Your question about how do we, encourage the shipping guy to think differently. I know a few of you here have heard me have these like signal rants in the morning, and I don't have an answer, and I'm curious to see if the room has an answer just about how we encourage more long-term thinking, because I think there is a lot of short-term thinking, both in terms of how we tackle climate change, but just in everything, right? Like gas prices and all of these things, and we're not really encouraging long-term thinking to seek those solutions. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm really curious if anybody does, because it's a grand frustration of mine.
No.
One small thing, if you were interested in making the nuclear shipping thing work, France has a nuclear industry that they really like, and maybe you should try and convince the French that they want to have a nationalized shipping fleet.
So if our solution to climate change is trust the French. I'm joking.
I'm
The French
going
are
to toss out a
actually
few random facts about nuclear shipping. Is stupid.
Yes. Oh.
First,
okay.
of course, you need miniature reactors, and the smaller your reactor, the higher grade the fuel is, and it will basically be closer to weapons grade. That's one of the reasons. Well, they have these lovely tiny nuclear reactors in submarines, but they're all military submarines. For nuclear proliferation purposes, the idea of having Liberian flagged container ships having a submarine in the grade nuclear fuel on board, I am not looking forward to that particular perspective.
That's with traditional reactors, not like modern ceramic. So pebble or
Pebble
salt.
bed reactors are actually a bloody dead end, because pebble bed reactors turn out to be worse than the previous generations.
Oh, okay.
They're really shite safety-wise, because cause the graphite. The pebbles are made of graphite, and the temperature shrinks and expands, so they create graphite dust, which is the least lovable substance. Yeah. But basically, long story short, before I give it to Anke, nuclear is shite in general, and especially at small scale. I would say, look into the figures, for example, to kites. There's at least one Hamburg startup. You can already replace up to 6 megawatt using massive kites that are automatically steered. For the big container ships, you need about 30 megawatt. That's not a terribly big jump to go for wind when you're really offshore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Nice. I agree with Walter. But we should not run into using other non-renewables for shipping. We should go to renewable energy sources like wind or even solar. Probably, I don't know how good it is possible on ships. That's probably has to be researched. But I think wind will certainly be possible.
Okay. I'm slightly more optimistic about nuclear, but I do understand the drawbacks that are being mentioned. But yeah.
I was. I was going to suggest that rather than the solution to the shipping problem is don't ship stuff.
Yes.
Build it, make it closer to where it's needed.
As much as possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like 3D printing.
Yeah, very good idea.
In Iceland then.
Huh?
No advocates in Iceland.
No, exactly. And people aren't going to be happy with it. But
Maybe 3D printed tomatoes one time. No, I'm responding to something I heard here. saying they're not made to last, and that makes me think of planned obsolescence.
Yeah. Good one.
Companies profit from constantly having renewed consumer cycles, and that seems to be a very hard issue to fix, because how are you going to revamp the whole economic system in one go? It all entails many other systems, and it's just world reform actually what you need. But I don't know how to solve it. If anyone has the slightest of ideas, I would love to hear.
So yeah, no, this is a really good point, and also I discovered that I really rely on autocorrect when I write the word obsolescence. So sorry, so one of the ways we deal with that is stronger consumer protection laws, and in particular warranties. Right, longer warranties basically force longer term things, but one of the things that always happens, and this is kind of like the trap function type thing, is if the warranty is required to be 3 years, then all of the equipment, all of the things are going to be designed to last 3 years and 1 day, right? And be very skewed so they don't end up accidentally breaking 2 years and 11 months, right? So the question is not just how do we lengthen warranties, and that's something that should be relatively easy to advocate for on the European level. European Union loves messing around with consumer protection law, but the other thing is, how do you disincentivize this warranty length plus 1 day behavior? And that's kind of partially belongs in the indifference category, but
And also, how do you foster reuse, repair, recycle kind of behavior?
there's good news on that one.
Oh, I mean, could this be done with some kind of like tax policy that essentially was meant to like drive recycling and other things? So essentially, after the product at some point, some EU thing says, okay, this product has been EOL'd, we believe, roughly speaking, and so we're going to impose this tax on the manufacturer based on sort of how much was EOL'd when and blah blah blah. Is that at all sane?
No. So actually, I kind of like the direction you're going in here. So the good news was around right to repair in Europe. Somebody here probably knows the details of this a lot better than I do, but the right to repair is actually making progress in a lot of places. So that's good. But regarding that idea, so there's a lot of places that still do like tax incentives for electric vehicles, but one idea that's come up is kind of flipping the script on that and say rather, let's pay people a higher amount of money to take older vehicles that pollute a lot out of distribution, like basically make there be fewer bad vehicles on the road rather than paying for there to be more supposedly good ones, right? So how about we do that on a slightly bigger scale and just start to provide tax incentives for using equipment for longer periods of time. So we want to get rid of the old clunker cars that are polluting a lot, but we probably want people to live in older houses because the most carbon efficient house is the one that's already built, right? Not necessarily, okay.
If you use concrete or not.
Yeah, okay.
Actually, concrete once poured.
Yeah.
Concrete, once poured, is a CO2 absorbent. The problem is the production of the cement beforehand. My problem, my skepsis, and I will get back to the remark just made before, my skepsis about the house already built is the most carbon, it's actually not true, because especially in the climates at these latitudes, you will burn so much fuel in heating the house that sometimes it's actually better to demolish it and replace it with a new net zero house. As a general remark about tax incentives and so forth, do realize when you make policy, it's always best to give tax incentives or penalize behavior at as central place as possible. So your supplier of your low quality plasticky goods will probably at the European level not be the manufacturer but an importer. That's someone you can talk to, but by the time that plasticky crappy product is at the end of life, the person holding it is a consumer, and the manufacturer will be sitting somewhere in Southeast Asia because that's the world's workshop currently, and therefore is out of reach for your. So the moment you want to touch that supply, that life cycle of the product is at the point of importation into the European Union.
So you.
Yeah, I have two comments, but I think the first one I have is still about the discussions 5 minutes ago about transport, ships, etc. And the second one is about concrete. I think if you think about the long term, somebody told me that using concrete is in the beginning really bad for the environment. But if you use it more than 50 years, it's even better to use concrete than wood or something else. No?
Wait, just response first.
Wood is in many ways provided that it has been forested in a sustainable way. So assuming sustainable forestry practices, wood is way better. Cement is really shite because it's actually worse than steel per ton in terms of CO2 emission. But a lot of cement use could be replaced by wood. So engineered wood though. So more modern lumbers. Basically anything a few meters above ground level could easily, even into high rises. There's currently a 80-meter tall building in Norway which is made out of engineered lumber, and we will probably see within the next decade wood buildings raising higher than 100 meters. So for normal buildings, for utility buildings, slightly different, or especially for civil works like viaducts and so on, that is more out there. But for housing and office buildings, wood is a very interesting solution to construction materials.
Maybe go have another idea. For all products that actually are supplied with the energy label right now, maybe put on the energy label the expected life cycle of this product also.
Oh yeah.
And then if you put this expected life cycle, the customer knows what to expect, and then also what the energy use or the CO2 usage or whatever, you can derive that from that, and also maybe include some warranty statements in that.
So we have that on light bulbs, but it would be nice to have it on everything else, right?
Yep.
So yeah, could you pass that?
Cars, on washing machines, or
Yeah.
whatever.
I think we must think about which products to reuse, which products to recycle, and which products just to break down. For example, furniture. If some old people die or go to a nursery home or something, and there is a lot of furniture, often very good, we can reuse that. That doesn't consume any energy, and it's better to reuse this. But if it's electronic stuff, probably the new thing would use much less energy. So it depends on the life cycle. You have to look at the special thing you want to recycle or anything. But for example. Mobile phones, it's catastrophic how low the life cycle is. But you could recycle them, but you should use them for much longer. On the other hand, about houses, well, you have also new materials like or very old materials. In fact, straw and clay to build houses. That seems to be very energy efficient as well. So we should use that much more.
I just wanted to say a really quick note about concrete and renewable materials. Like the type of sand that we use for concrete, we're rapidly running out of it. And it's finite, so we can't kind of just grow it like we do with trees. So that's just another reason to kind of just throw that out there.
So if instead of just labeling for life cycle, you could augment the VAT. Like you could have the VAT increase with a shorter life cycle, and then
It's hard to do.
Okay, and then there's another thing. So it's very. I mean, phones are. I'm not sure that's that big of a problem, but phones specifically, because if they have a SIM card in them, you could you could make the carriers charge higher taxes if the phone is younger.
So yeah, I think things like that are very difficult, and especially so. One thing I learned during my time in politics is that tax authorities really hate it when you mess with tax policy. Like it's just complicated for them, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but we need to be very specific in how. One note: we've been going on for slightly over an hour. I think we have one more hour. Is that right? Yeah. So I don't necessarily want us to use the full extra hour just for shits and giggles. I think we need to be a little concrete. But one thing is, we've been very focused on the sadistic policy and actually how to make less sadistic policy. Nobody has talked about how we improve our luck. And very little about the indifference except for the incentives. I did actually write the life cycle expectations into there. I think that's a really good way of powering like consumer sentiment. And I wrote down conversations, because conversations like this one are, I think, a massively good antidote to indifference, but they sometimes end up preaching to the choir a bit. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to comment a bit on the tax incentives, because I think it's often overlooked, especially also by politicians, that, well, every tax incentives and etc. Drives, like, is counterproductive in that there's some kind of like pricing issue, both because it's more complex, but also basically, for instance, with electric cars, prices for electric cars in countries where there are tax incentives are generally higher than in countries where there are no tax incentives, because there's also a higher demand and etc. and they can ask more. So what you're doing is you're not only giving money to consumers, you're actually subsidizing producers, and that could be okay, but you should at least be aware that this is what happens if you do these kind of incentives. And then with other things like the kind of like incentives to do away with your very old polluting car, what we've seen in the Netherlands with things like that happened like years ago is that that also didn't really work out in terms of overall pollution and landfill and etc. So these are very complex things to steer in, and usually you'll have economic side effects that are not one-to-one related to what you're trying to steer. So usually other measures are preferable before you get to that.
Yeah. Also, we can stand up and just, if you want, but wait.
I was first, actually.
Oh, okay.
I would, as a matter of combating indifference, I would please drop the bloody lingo of having to save the planet or the ecosystem or the lovely pandas. The fucking pandas need porno to reproduce. They're a Darwinistic failure. Fuck the pandas. Really. And the whales and so on. This is not selling well outside your own little circles. Or maybe large circles. I don't care about the size of your circles. There is a massive circle that you need, or massive bunch of circles that have difficulties making ends meet at the end of the month, who have fuel poverty, who will not be able to buy an electric car until second-hand electric cars will become affordable in another decade or so. None of these people will be convinced by a need to save the planet if they have difficulties to have both to pay their rent and their energy bill at the end of the month in February. It's about us, it's about humanity, it's about our children.
Yes, I have a comment about luck.
Okay, very good.
Yes. You mentioned before that we just don't know how to fix it, how to fix the problems,
Yeah.
right? Because it's a macro issue that involves every possible system in our entire biosphere. And we need to understand that better so that we can plan accordingly, not just to make individual changes, but to make changes that will cascade in our benefit. So that's how we improve our luck. Right?
Yeah.
We research, we plan multi-pronged attacks. When we see an area is going to fall and it will not support civilization living there anymore, can we turn it into greenland that will continue to help us even as people move, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, we could even retitle these as care more, make better decisions, and learn, right? So, and the learning is absolutely right. I mean, if there's one aspect that I'm trying to tackle in my work, it's really reducing the catastrophic luck, if anything.
So I do think I have a comment that at least maybe slightly longer term on the catastrophic luck side. So sort of, and so I'm certainly not going to be defending pandas, but so all technology and all evolution is basically path dependent. You know, if you have something, you know, we can know how to do it. Every species that we exterminate, we're losing knowledge, and this is going to impact what is possible for us in the future as a species. So at some point, it is better to, you know, if it's a choice between, you know, I mean, if it's okay, we're going to lose a lot of people, but if it's a choice between, you know, at some point you do want to conserve a lot of these other species, you know, certainly biomes in the ground and bees and shit like this.
Two things. I think we should flip them. So it's, what was the indifference one? Was care more, learn, and then make better decisions.
Yeah, agreed.
And then regarding the pandas and all that, it actually is just a really neat communications and behavioral psychology problem that has largely been solved around ownership of a problem. So they've done this research with just like charities around like children. When we talk about our children rather than those children and their children, people are more likely to donate money. It's seriously as simple as that.
Okay. So I'm a little bit stuck on how we progress, because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already. I know a lot of you still have comments, and I want to try to get them. But what I'm thinking is, you know, this is a hope session, and I think, you know, what I set out to kind of try to get to is like, okay, you know, the 1.5 degree temperature raising situation, that ship has sailed. We might be able to get it back, but probably not. There is this catastrophic 8 degree scenario. How do we avoid that? And, you know, so our cocktail. But what I'd like, you know, so let's continue the conversation, not necessarily for much longer, you know, let's maybe give it 20 minutes or so, but let's try to also, like, if you've got any good examples of projects or initiatives or new laws, regulations, or anything like that that's happening in your local area or something like that that you think other people should know about, this would be a great time to hear about it, because, you know, I feel like we're losing a little bit of momentum. We're getting a little bit into the weeds, and I would love to, you know, have like 15 ideas to go and like search for on the internet when this is over. Okay, so you had a comment?
Yeah, just also on the catastrophic luck. I think it mostly also comes down to awareness, because everyone has their equal part to play.
Yeah.
It's about wholeness. It's about involving everything, rethinking every system, because it entails all these other systems. All these systems are interdependent, and I think we should spend a lot of time on awareness, on education, and with a particular interest in systems thinking and systems dynamics, because yeah, they're all interwoven.
Yeah, very good.
So actually, I work for a paper mill in Eerbeek, In Eerbeek we have 3 paper mills since 1661, around that time. We also have our own water effluent plant. And I find it, I work already for 15 years there, and it's only recently now that the gas prices are humongous that we are really getting in trouble and pressure is really on. But I find difficult and at the same time is maybe hopeful. In that sense, I want to refer back to the Fab Lab, I'm sorry. Yeah. Is that what I lack is connectedness. So we have this factory area in Eerbeek, and we're on our own almost. It feels like, and yeah. So Holland is on its own as well, a very small country, only 25 paper mills. In Germany, you have over 300 paper mills, but it seems like everybody is working on its own, and I find that very depressing. And at the same time, I'm from the Fab Lab community. I know it's possible to start working together, and so how can we do that? That is my question.
So on that, there's, I think, a lot about empowering people with information, and I know that that's like a really popular thing to say right now, but I just want to talk quickly about a project that I know of in South Africa that is not climate related, but I think kind of plays into this a little bit, and it's townships. It turns out that in Cape Town, they have extremely good plat maps. Like, they know where everything is, which is surprising to some people. So what these people in townships have done is gone, hold on a second, we have access to these plat maps, we can understand what our towns are supposed to look like, and they've started to do lots of really amazing community building around, like, installing lights in schools and things. They're making their community safer. So it's a lot of that kind of like information gathering, information building and learning, and then working with your community. And whether that's really local within your town or your region or like whatever it is, I think there's a way to build onto that. So I think that's part of the answer. If you're armed with information, you can build community.
I have a thing that sort of excites me, but that's on the other end of the scale because it's not very local or low scale. But basically, currently, every 2-3 months, there's another offshore floating wind concept being pushed out by the kind of industrial firms that can make that happen. So I fully expect us to that Europe may be able to be ahead of the curve on electricity generation just based on offshore wind. And what is interesting is this is stuff that is specifically designed to become mass produced. Specifically to be designed to be relatively low cost maintenance, because offshore wind is more expensive than onshore wind because you have to helicopter in maintenance technicians or bring in expensive ships to make them, etc. This is all designed to be built in harbors, brought into the ocean by tugboats and then connected to local grids for hydrogen electrolysis. This is all not there yet, but this is something that is pretty viable to happen within the next decade. And I will shut up a little.
Actually, one thing just came to mind about the optimistic side. So there's at events like this, we have a slight tendency to be very, shall we say, suspicious of like capitalistic tendencies and like that kind of thing. But it's interesting that like now we're in the middle of this like massive economic downturn, pretty much hitting every country in the world. Pretty much like we're seeing double-digit inflation. It's like everything's pretty bad. One of the things that was happening back in like October, November, December is that basically like every single week there was a new venture capital fund established to fund climate tech research or climate technology of some kind or other. There's so much money slushing about in the system for developing technologies to help with climate change that like it's kind of almost obnoxious at the moment. And one of the things that's really positive is now we're in this economic downturn and none of those funds has gone away. The investment rate might have slowed down a little bit, but the same amount of money is still available. And so when I'm like thinking about the overall big picture of like how we're going to tackle this, there's definitely a tendency to go like, oh yeah, we're going to need a revolution and we're going to need to restructure everything and like, but like humanity's been through a few hard places in the past, one or two maybe, and like yeah, sometimes we have fundamentally restructured our system, but often we've like just used systems that we already have in efficient ways. And I think like when it comes to the technologies that are emerging, you know, we have more and more carbon capture plants. I actually don't really believe much in the idea of like you know, if you are trying to capture carbon from the atmosphere, you need to you're capturing about 300 grams per ton of processed air. I don't think that's very like, you know, scalable. But hey, you know, like people are doing all sorts of cool stuff. Some of the projects are absolute bullshit, but like there are such good projects in between that actually we're seeing progress. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier the Great Green Wall project. Have all of you heard of that? It's so for a few who didn't seem to be nodding, it's this idea that they're going to like build like so grow a world wonder, a green belt right across the southern end of the Sahara, specifically to try and slow down the expansion of the Sahara Desert. Now, deserts are problematic in some ways. Some of them are natural. There's a natural desert I found out a few days ago in Poland. It's not very big, but like there's a desert in Poland. Yeah, but and Sahara is at least for our purposes nowadays natural, and the amount of material from the Sahara that feeds into the Amazon is like huge and super important. So we don't necessarily want to eliminate the Sahara, but managing to combat desertification on that scale is kind of mind-blowing. So you know, every effort that supports things like that, I think, will make a huge impact. So, like, yeah, I just wanted to mention a few positive projects. Anybody else got one?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of agrivoltaics look really promising. There seems to be a lot of investment in that because people in Southern Europe seem to be figuring out that they need to manage the humidity of their crops, and it's useful for that.
Yeah, I have a side quest at the moment that is around agro-photovoltaics, and specifically in the context of developing countries. So one of the things that happens, for those not super into power grids, is so if you have countries with very underdeveloped power grids, the few locations where there is a power grid are typically close to the cities, and the land immediately around the city is where you're going to have the most contention or most competition for land, because that's the best way to import food into the city. And so what you want to do is you need more electricity, but you can't take that land away from the agricultural use. So by mixing those together, building photovoltaics that are raised about 4 to 6 meters above the agricultural land, so you can still do farming underneath. It reduces the heat stress on the plants. It reduces the evaporation of water, while and makes it possible to grow things that you might not be able to grow in a much warmer environment. But it's not perfect, and we don't have good out of the box models for it yet. So. But yeah, it's super cool. Thanks for mentioning that. Huh? I think there's starting to be more of it in France. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I'm super excited about meat replacements and general vegetarian-based options. One of the founders of the Vegetarian Butcher, Dutch company, now started the Vegan Cowboys. And the company tries to create a yeast which can create milk directly from grass. So you just cut out the whole cow in between.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's super awesome. Campina, the Dutch milk company, said, "Oh, we're not afraid," but I think they're afraid, and I hope they're afraid because I love cows. I hope they can stay on this planet even after the dairy industry, but they're not as efficient in creating milk.
Horses are still around, not as many as in the 19th century, but they're still
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's a Canadian startup called Carbacrete that sounds interesting. They are working with the steel industry in Canada and capturing their waste CO2 and shoving it into concrete instead of sand. It is producing net negative carbon concrete.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so steel mills are a pet peeve of mine because they produce about 7% of all CO2 that's released, and nobody ever complains about them. You know, because nobody sees steel mills. They're just like they're just there. But yeah, no, that's super cool.
All the big steel producers are looking into hydrogen-based steel production because steel production ultimately is a redox reaction. You want to pull out the oxygen that is inside iron oxide, and currently you use syngas for that, which you produce based on with coal, but you can't do it with hydrogen. There is a viable way forward to close to net zero steel in the reasonably near close future.
Yeah. Oh, and on that note, the aluminum industry. So the way aluminum is, so you take bauxite from the ground, you process it. It's actually a very horrible process that needs to be fixed with that. It's lots of lye, lots of bad bases. But when you get the aluminum or aluminum oxide powder, essentially, it needs to be you need to remove the oxygen from it, and the way they do that is through electrolysis. And so what has been done for pretty much, since the whole Haro process was created, is they use these giant carbon-based electrodes, and the oxygen is being pulled to the carbon, and then that releases the CO2. So it's a very CO2-rich and bad process. So now some people in Iceland, incidentally, have developed a new type of electrode for aluminum smelting that is carbon neutral. So I don't know if they've gotten into production yet, but the testing's basically done. So that's positive.
I think there are so many cool projects at the moment, and 2 or 3 months ago I saw that you can be a volunteer, an energy coach within your city. So what you do, you get they teach you first what you should do as a coach, and then you go to people and then educate them. Like, let's say turn off the lights if you go away. But they also help you to find which areas in your house are is wind coming through. So I think it's not really cool, but it will help. So you go to people, you make them aware, and they start thinking about, okay, if I use small initiatives or steps, it can save me money. And maybe it will turn out that they become, I say, they also provide us ideas back about sustainability.
Yeah, cool. So I think we're maybe done. Are we? That's amazing. As okay, it's been a it's been a rough session. We've had to go through a lot of stuff, right? But we came into this with, okay, what are the conditions needed for everything to be absolutely terrible? And now we're kind of at a point where, like, we know what to do. We need to care more. We need to learn more. We need to make better decisions. This is fantastic, right? We've heard about some cool projects. We know that there are many more cool projects out there. And I think, if we go through the points here, we want to improve the incentives, but we need to have these conversations. We need to experience connectedness and and train each other. To your last point, we need to understand the life cycles of our things. We need to improve learning and research and awareness around that. Introduce more systems thinking into the entire process. Think in longer term as much as possible, and then on the policy side, or making decisions, internalize the externalities. I think we came back to that point about 15 times, and if we'd come back to it 1,500 more times, it wouldn't have been less true. So we do have some weeds here. Meat industry, the aviation industry is not perfect. Shipping, la la la. Definitely need to fix monocultures, but we still like being able to get avocados in the polar regions, right? But I love this one. Protect the poor. Being a little bit humane about the fact that there's a lot of countries where people are still struggling with the basic necessities of life, and just being, making sure that they don't get fucked over by us being trying to save the planet. Because if we save the planet but fuck them over in the process, then they might be incentivized to fuck us over next time, and it'll be nasty. So let's protect everybody. Reform land and stop plant obsolescence and 15 million other things that we might be able to do to improve our lives. But you know what? I'm pretty hopeful. It's not perfect. It's going to be hard, but we'll win. Okay? You want a final point? Okay.
You briefly said you're a recovering anarchist. Can you talk? Oh, okay. Can you talk about it?
So I normally don't anarchist in public because it confuses people a lot. But generally, if I must label myself with some kind of political label, I would say mutualist. So. I believe in free markets and networks of exchange and that kind of thing, but I also want it to be voluntary and non-coercive and on a individual communal basis. So and so the book that Ella was talking about yesterday, The Dawn of Everything. I think that the ideas that are presented in there about a non-coercive society, they fit very nicely with that kind of mutualist political economy and things like that. But yeah, this is off topic, so maybe we can talk about it over a beer later. But does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, but I mean, regardless of what our politics are or where we come from, does everybody roughly agree that we've made some progress in the direction of being hopeful? Okay. Perfect. And my job here is done. Thank you very much. See you at the bar.